Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. My name is Lisette Coley, and as Vice President of Parapsychology Foundation, and on behalf of our Board of Trustees and our President, Mrs. Eileen Coley, I welcome you here this evening. We're very pleased to have with us Mr. Chip Brown to present this evening's Perspective series. Chip is a very well-known journalist. He's been a past staff reporter of the Washington Post and written many articles for many magazines, New York Times Magazine, Vanity Fair, the list goes on and on. And lots of awards about that too. Now, Chip, we found him in our library one day, and at one point he was warming up a seat back there for many, many days, as a matter of fact. We used to tease him and say, put him on the table. And we also said in that time that should a manuscript ever come of all his hard work, please, please, please don't forget Parapsychology Foundation. So we're very pleased that he's given birth to a wonderful book entitled Afterwards You're a Genius, Faith, Medicine, and the Metaphysics of Healing. And he's here with us now, a man of his word, to share it with us and also explain the title. So I'm going to give you Chip Brown. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this okay on the mic?
Right.
This feels a lot like a healing table without the pad. I don't want to lie down halfway there. I thought I was sort of intimidated by lecturing to the parapsychology library crowd because I'm not a PhD or a journal. I'm a journalist, not an academic. But so I thought I would. I thought I wouldn't do that. I thought I would read something and then maybe we could discuss healing and maybe either writing about healing or what healing is or where healing is, and go from there. I'm happy to. I want to tell you a little bit about this book. I'm going to read. There's 7 chapters. There's one. I organized the book around the chakras, which was the only great idea I had. Everything else seems like half-baked, second-hand opinions and stuff. The chakra idea gave the book, in a weird way, an energy system, and also gave me a direction, which was up from the groin to the crown of the head. Whatever that, wherever that takes you, at least it's an idea. It's more than I had when I started. And I'm going to read some of the 4th chapter, which is the heart chakra. Joanne said this was a Valentine's Day reading, so I haven't read any of that yet. I've been reading from the 2nd chapter, which was the account of the first healer I ever went to. And that chapter was called Bludgeoning the Ineffable. And that was really getting hit over the head with a hammer by a healer in a kind of metaphorical way. And thinking, my God, everything I understand about what's real, what the body is, and what the mind is completely out of date and idiotic, and I've never really looked at any of this stuff, and I better go back and start reading all those books, that a lot of which I bought in high school and never read. I strangely found a lot of my books that I was buying when I was a high school student were relevant. So either this is a regression, a terrible regression, or there's some sort of progress in it. Anyway, the 4th chapter is the heart chakra, and that's the key. Not the key to Valentine's Day, obviously. It's the key to, some people say it's the key to all healing, and which is strange because it's somewhat contradictory. You hear a lot about the 7th chakra, which is called Sahasrara, which is this where the divine energy or the divine, whatever it is that's divine, enters the human life. And yet there's something in the heart that's equally large and mysterious. And it's contained in. I thought it was beautifully depicted in one of the Upanishads. And this is, someone might know how to pronounce this. Chanadogya, I think it's called, or Chanadogya. It reads like this: in this body, in this town of spirit, there is a little house shaped like a lotus, and in that house there is a little space. One should know what is there. What is there? Why is it so important? There is as much there in that little space within the heart as there is in the whole world outside. Heaven, earth, fire, wind, sun, moon, lightning, stars, whatever is and is not, everything is there. And that was the epigraph to this chapter. And that's sort of the experiences I had a glimpse of in the book, in the parts that come before what I'm going to read. I had gone through a couple of healings. I went to a clairvoyant who knocked my socks off by telling me about a girlfriend that I'd broken up with, and it's just things that you can't make sense of, and if you don't have the experience of being flabbergasted, you will discount them as coincidence, and it could have been coincidence. I still could discount it as coincidence, but this kind of coincidence I should have more often. So the fourth chapter starts with a section called Valentine Pump, and in those two words, there's sort of the whole problem of the re-spiritualization of medicine, because medicine looks at the heart as a pump, and patients look at the heart as a valentine and a pump. But why do we double the heart up with this other stuff? And I started this chapter. I started all these chapters. I tried to start in the material and go toward the immaterial, or start in the physical and go toward the metaphysical, or in the concrete and toward the whatever the opposite of concrete is. It depends on who you are describing it. It could be, it's been described as zany idiocy, but it also could be beauty and joy and these qualities that you can't put your hands on. So I watched open heart surgery. And in the open heart surgery, this is for the first time at Columbia University, there was a healer that was invited into the operating room. And part of this was in the New York Times magazine, and I've kind of developed it out of that for the purposes of the book. So I'm going to read a truncated version of it. I'm going to skip some of the biographical stuff about the doctor, a little bit of it, and then I hope we can talk about healing and the heart and Valentine's Day, which is sort of a horrible commercial holiday. But anyway, this is called Valentine Pump. Even before Mrs. Donadio was wheeled into operating room 21, and the dire circumstances of her heart were made manifest in the blooms of blood and the odor of sawed bone and cauterized flesh, I found myself wondering about the status of my own heart, not its life as a valentine, or a doormat, or a demilitarized zone, but its life as a pump, which is to say not the mind's heart, the psychic locus of love, courage, grief, yearning, not the heart that waxes glad at roses and wedding vows, and in its more preposterous moments palpitates over Hallmark poetry and the theme song from Hair, not the heart known to the healer's hand as a plexus of frequencies whirling over the chest, or the clairvoyant heart heralded as the gateway of the astral plane, or the heart envisioned by yogi masters as the 12-petaled chakra Anahata, with a goddess bathing in nectar that drips down from the pineal gland on a spindle of light. Not the mind's heart, which has 1,000 guises, but the body's heart, which has but one, the dogged pump, the cause for wonder. Given the setting, an operating room at New York's Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in April 1995, how could it be otherwise? Everything in OR 21, from the refrigerated air to the flensing light, was set up to help the body's heart survive its strictest crisis. Everything underscored the materiality of the surgical view and made all the subtler dimensions of the heart, such as they might be, seem elusive and trivial, fey conceits that would collapse at the first sign of chest pain. Chest pain, or perhaps nothing more dramatic than close inspection. I remembered a story I'd read once about the young ascetic Diane Sarasvati, who lived in India in the 19th century, when the heart chakra was supposed to have a material existence, to be as physical as the bone of the ribs or the protective shroud of the pericardium. Diane discovered a corpse in a river one day, and thinking he might have a closer look at the physical structure of the chakra, he began to dissect it, only there wasn't a chakra to be found at the heart or anywhere else where the wheels of light were supposed to be spinning and distributing prana. While Diane may have based his subtle energy anatomy on the wrong assumptions, his disenchantment ran deep, and out of it was born the reformed Hindu sect called Arya Samaj. So it goes, time and again, facts indifferent to theories, the mind's ideas dashed on the body's truth. In the name of science, you try to sweep away all the Valentines, the myths, the fanciful ideas. Aristotle's heart is the seat of the soul, Galen's Prince of all bowels heart, with its egregiously confused blueprint for the circulating blood. You try to see the pump for what it is, to see the tissue without the prejudice of dreams. Like Thoreau on Mount Katahdin, driven half out of his mind by the actual earth, the stone force and glory of the real. And yet they cannot be dismissed entirely, these fey conceits, for they seem to lie at the heart of what we think we are. And even the effort to see without conceptions itself depends on conception. Some habit, some countervailing perversity or froward spirit rises up, and you find yourself reaching for the pulse of a Valentine in a room dedicated to the exigencies of a pump. Valentine pump, Valentine pump. The refrain thumped in my head like the mocking chant of either or, that the little ruffians shouted at Kierkegaard as the broken-hearted philosopher wandered the streets of Copenhagen, distraught because he had disengaged his fiancée and sacrificed marital happiness to pursue the queer and lonely work of founding existentialism. Equate your identity with the memorabilia of the Valentine heart, and you may have to reckon with the possibility that there is no there, that it's all a fiction. I know I felt some presentiment of the void growing as I watched the nurses rack the scalpels and the clamps and the sterile towels and saw the perfusionists at the heart-lung machine whispering over a thicket of tubes, and the fall of the doctors in the blue gowns and white masks and blood-spattered rubber clogs as they scrubbed under their nails and soaped their arms and entered the OR, holding their hands, wet hands aloft, looking for a moment like cormorants drying their wings. Would Descartes have dared define reality as thought in the razor light of OR 21? Nothing untangles the knots of the mind-body problem faster than a scalpel. I suppose I was afraid, for Mrs. Donadio on the brink of her ordeal, for the cormorant surgeons for whom her coronary bypass was just another death-defying stroll on the high wire of modern medicine, for myself, some kind of queasy, illusion-mantled greenhorn, awaiting whatever revelations were to be found in the heart's exposure. The head anesthesiologist arrived, a bluff woman named Samantha Mullins in her late 30s. Her eyes cut around the room. You I know, you I know, you I know. She turned to me, you I don't. I explained I had been invited to watch the operation by the head surgeon that morning, Dr. Mehmet Oz. The prerogatives of a successful surgeon like Oz are akin to those of a ship captain in the 19th century. Dr. Mullis smiled, or seemed to, behind her mask, and asked me if I would be all right with the sight of blood. In a grim sort of way, I was keen on it, as if nothing short of blood and the literal tissue of the pump itself could break open the sorrows of the Valentine, the heart pain I had buried but was loath to feel. And here I just want to say I'm alluding to something earlier, a dream I had in which I had been engaged to a woman and it had worked out, and I had this dream that I pulled her out of a lake and with my whole family trying to revive her with our hands, and she was dead. It's just another one of those dreams you have when you've eaten too much pizza at 11:30. We held her on our laps and put our hands on her and tried to warm her back to life, but there was nothing we could do. She was gone. At the risk of taking apart the story I have been putting together, I was beginning to understand that much of my intellectual quandary was based on emotional numbness and ignorance of the heart. My heart, other hearts, hearts in all their guises. In the paradigm of energy healing, I would have been diagnosed as having a kind of subtle heart disease. Or not so subtle as the case may be. The ecstatic expansion that had occurred when I went to the healer Joel Wallach's healing table had not lasted, nor had the rush of heartfelt love that swept over my apartment after Barbara Brennan had fooled around with my fourth chakra. Those experiences cast long shadows, even in recession. They were the 2 free issues you got with your Trial magazine subscription, a couple of psychic joyrides, courtesy of the universe. For more you had to pay, and not with an Amex card. Pay by working. You had to do the work. But what was the work? It wasn't trotting to the library, the Parapsychology Foundation, whatever you might say, to dig through the history of the vital force, or mulling over the careers of the genius crackpots who got caught up in the illimitable whirlwind, which is one of the names that Carlyle had for the mysterious force that animates life. I had begun a meditation practice. I sat in silence half an hour every morning. It seemed an important discovery to learn that the Chinese phrase for meditation was remembering truths of the heart. And I was struck by the tenet in Buddhism that holds that the process of waking up often starts with suffering. In our private suffering, we develop compassion for the pain that binds all sentient creatures. But in meditation, I had not been able to recapture the intensity of those altered states induced by healers. On my own, it seemed, I could not engage the heart, my heart, as it had been engaged in the two healings. In a way, I was trained to disengage. In a way, I was my own anesthesiologist. Numbness was very useful, or had been, until the consequences of living with a chronic leeriness of emotions began to pile up. At the time, I hardly grasped my own unwillingness to face the heart directly, my heart, the Valentine heart, or why I was loath to risk presenting it without the ironic mediation of clownish metaphors like doormat, demilitarized zone, figures of speech that made light of heavy emotion. What I could grasp was that OR 21 was a theater dedicated to the ultimate heart trouble, and to a level of suffering that was grave enough to make a dozen other brands of pain, my own included, seem almost like blessings in disguise. Blood? I nodded to the anesthesiologist. Let it flow. Promptly at 7:30. This is taking a long time. I hope this isn't too long. If this is boring, you guys can just raise your hands and I'll stop. Promptly at 7:30, two attendants wheeled in the 49-year-old computer operator from Nutley, New Jersey. Joyce Donadio had diabetes. She was a lifelong smoker. A week earlier, she had gotten an urgent bulletin from her heart in the form of severe chest pain. Chest pain is one of the most common symptoms that sends people to the doctor, but in more than half the cases, no cause related to the body's heart can be found. The body's heart is simply expressing some agitation of the mind's. Mrs. Donadio would have been overjoyed to discover her pain was only, say, a panic disorder registering on the exquisitely sensitive seismograph of her heart. But her angiogram revealed that hardly any blood was getting through the three main arteries that fed her left ventricle. She had a myocardial infarction. Her heart, the undeniably material heart that pumps, was dying for want of oxygen. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. As one of 300,000 coronary bypasses performed annually in the U.S., the operation that morning was run-of-the-mill stuff, bread and butter work for Dr. Oz, another day's lesson in the art of patching hearts for his team of medical students, residents, and fellows who would handle much of the preliminary cutting and snipping. But in one retrospect, the script was unlike any other. Oz had added a wild card to the cast, a brown-haired, 53-year-old hands-on healer named Judy Motz. With Oz's blessing and the patient's permission, Julie was planning to lay hands on Mrs. Donadio for the duration of her 8 hours under the knife. This was the angle that had caught my interest, at least on the surface, the cultural incongruity of a hands-on healer practitioner in the inner sanctum of a modern medical temple. I don't want to further belabor the tension between mainstream medicine and the fringe. It's clear many hospitals have reformed their ideas of care in the 2 decades since a bunch of therapeutic touch healers returned from a weekend training seminar to find a sternly dizzy memo from their administrator saying, "There will be no healing in this hospital." Orthodoxies change. In an article in the March 1997 issue of Clinical Cardiology, the editor-in-chief Richard Conti wrote, "About 20 years ago, I took care of a patient who was admitted into our coronary care unit with an uncomplicated myocardial infarction. On day 2 of his infarction, I noticed he had a peculiar yellow cast to his skin. I subsequently learned that his wife had rubbed vitamin E all over his body. At the time, I thought his patient's wife was slightly crazy. Maybe she knew something I didn't." Today, vitamin E is a staple of heart-conscious diets, and therapeutic touch is practiced in many hospitals, including Presbyterian. But installing a hands-on healer in an operating room in a university medical center still remains a radical departure. That spring in 1995, when I witnessed Joyce Donadio's operation in Columbia, it was almost, sacrilegious, akin to letting a clown help out at a Catholic Mass. The heart Julie Motz proposed to monitor had never been approached before in OR 21. Under the prevailing medical model, its very existence was in doubt. Anyone was well within his rights to ask how relevant the mind's heart was to a bypass operation, to the health of a heart that was incontrovertibly physical. Wasn't the mind's heart, whatever its actual nature, part of that dream country on the far side of the Cartesian divide, and thus incapable of influencing the function of the pump? Julie Motz was claiming that the mind's heart could affect the material welfare of the body's heart, but what evidence suggested the dream-drenched Valentine and the pump were linked, or supported her contention that the apparent differences of the mind's heart and the body's heart had nothing to do with the actual nature of the organ, but with the various ways one might touch it? For every physical event, there's a corresponding emotional and mental event, Motz told me a few days earlier. That's what I'm working on. It's not weird. If we were educated in an intuitive culture for 12 years the way we are in an analytical culture, it wouldn't seem all that strange. Thought and feeling are energy, and what I'm trying to do is pick up the energy of those thoughts and feelings and feed them back to the patient. It's very logical. As ever, it sounded nice in theory, but with precious little to say that energy work would make a difference, Mats had to rely on Mehmet Oz's willingness to sail uncharted waters. In most hospitals, the only way a healer can participate in cardiac surgery is to have a heart attack. Oz was not interested in alternative medicine just because it was different. Mainstream studies in cardiac surgery had shown depression to be a key indicator of how long patients would survive after open heart surgery. Surgeons ignored the emotional and mental states at their patients' peril. Mats had donned the green scrubs for the first time some months before during one of Oz's transplant operations. It was sort of like bringing a play-by-play announcer versed in cricket down onto the field to comment on the action during a baseball game. Mats relayed the changes she was able to sense in the patient's energy field. As a bit of a maverick, bright but impolitic, used to pressing ahead without a lot of support and concern for the consensus opinion, Mats urged Oz to talk directly to the hearts he was transplanting. Oz replied that he would be laughed out of the operating room. The surgical team was already fighting the temptation to joke about the healer as they listened to her report on what she believed were patients' moods and emotions registered in her own body. During that first transplant operation, she said she could sense the patient's anger as a roughness in her chest, and his anxiety as turbulence in her stomach. At one point during her debut, Oz saw that Mats was beginning to look a little green around the gills. He asked a burly perfusionist named Jimmy Beck to take her outside for some air, and when Beck returned, his clown got the better of him. "I sense a change in my stomach," he said. "It's a tenseness. No, it's a growling. No, wait a minute. I'm just hungry." The attendants lifted Mrs. Donadio from the gurney onto the narrow operating table and bundled her in a blanket. With her arms lashed onto perpendicular rest, she looked vaguely like a martyr on a cross. She was wired up to a sophisticated computer system of sensors that brought her vital signs online. A mask went over her face, a catheter into her arm. A saline drip was started, a large bore catheter that would provide electronic reports of blood pressure and other crucial information had to be inserted into her right jugular vein and then threaded into her heart. Probably the most painful part of the operation she would undergo prior to anesthesia. Julie Mats was holding her hands. "Now, Mrs. Donadio," said an anesthesiology resident in a saccharine voice, "you'll feel a little prick." Blood gushed all over Mrs. Donadio's neck. She winced and rolled her head away and squeezed Mats's hand. The resident tried again, but he couldn't get the catheter into the vein. Mrs. Donadio's neck was beginning to look like something out of an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. Mats crouched beside her and whispered encouragement. It was clear that of the dozen or so people in the room, each with a precisely defined part to play in an intricate minuet, none had the time or inclination to offer any but the most perfunctory reassurance to Mrs. Donadio. Mats, at that point, had nothing to offer but reassurance. She took time. She poured herself into the connection, giving her complete attention to Mrs. Donadio. Does it sound trite? I am worried that such phrases cannot do justice to what seemed an act of witnessing. It was not that Mats alone understood what Mrs. Donadio might be going through in a general way, but that she had visited Mrs. Donadio in the hospital before the surgery and had gotten to know her, and in a specific way understood the impact of this procedure at this time on this woman, not the patient, not Donadio J, social security number such and such, but the soul of the woman in all its subtleties. Joyce with her thinning brown hair, and her worried husband Joe, and her bad habits, and her friends at work who sent in cards. Joyce, who missed her Yorkshire Terrier, Beau, and who found herself crying when she got to the hospital, but didn't know why. And Mrs. Donadio seemed deeply grateful to have the healer there, holding her hand, whispering into her ear that it would be all right, it would be all right. It struck me that you did not have to buy any of the way-out stuff about subtle energy or energy medicine or know anything about the heart chakra to see the effect of one woman's presence on another, and to understand the beauty and power inherent in that act of empathy. You did not have to know anything about medicine, east or west, to glimpse what it meant for one frightened human being to hold the hand of another at T-0. This is not to say that hand-holding obviated the need for an enormously complex operation, or that the loving presence of a healer could in any way substitute for the procedure. A chauvinist of Western medicine would argue that the technology itself was humane. Unlike at London Hospital in 1791, there was no bell to ring in OR 21 that would summon the attendants needed to hold the patient down when the surgeon was ready to begin. What Julie Motz was doing, was it anything more than being there, really? Was not the last word in the therapy that morning, but if it was not the whole of medicine, perhaps it had something to do with the heart of it. I'm going to skip ahead a little because this is much more than I thought it would be. I go outside of the operating room because I didn't want to watch the harrow that goes through the chest. I could deal with what was anything else. It was the transition from subject to object, of watching a person become an object is frightening. It wasn't torture, but it was close to it. It's a terrible thing to see, although it's in a good cause. And Oz hadn't had to do that. He just does the really delicate sewing and cutting work. So residents did that work. When we returned to OR 21, there was a terrible odor of burned flesh in the air, and Mrs. Donadio's breastbone had been riven in two, and her ribs spread apart by the cage of a stainless steel retractor. The surgeons were about to cut into the pericardium, the tough membrane around the heart. A whole new set of blue towels had been carefully laid over the drab green ones, building up a sort of stage for the delicate work to come. I went around the edge of the room to where Julie Motz and the anesthesiologist were standing, and peered down over the edge of my mask into the open chest. And suddenly I understood the depths of the word apocalypse, which comes from the Greek apokalyptein, meaning unveiled. The surgeon's scalpel pierced the pericardium, gloved hands flashed, needles were expertly worked through the membrane and then drawn back with tails of silk thread that were pulled tight and clamped off, so they held the pericardium out of the way like the guy lines on a tent. And there was Mrs. Donadio's heart. If you want to know what the soul looks like, look at the body, said Wittgenstein. But we don't. We look everywhere else, or don't look at all, as if we can't bear the idea that the two are even implicated in each other, much less one and the same. No improvisational word game was necessary. I think that's an old illusion. No word game was necessary to make the world seem new to me. Here was a terrible breach, opening with the strangeness of tissue and dream compounded, an intimacy of mind and body that was too intense, too claustrophobic, too morbid for everyday life. Suddenly I was confronted by my own complicity in the fiction of dualism, how much all of us require the configuration of mind and body, how eagerly we embrace the refuge of that Cartesian partition, which holistic medicine is so quick to deplore. Can the comfort of that division really be that much of a surprise? The separation we establish between mind and body is like a piece of sheetrock that divides a one-room house and affords us the means for keeping what we do not want to face at some remove, safely quartered in another room. The mind defines the otherness of the body, and mind remains mantled in the dream of its separate life until some crisis collapses the wall, and the ghost in the machine suddenly staggers under the weight of its chains and stumbles in the chalky rubble of its conceits, pierced by its inescapable relation and the implication that it is the lesser of two realities, that perhaps it was never anything but an artifact of the flesh, an illusion. For such hard lessons in the nature of duality, the Buddhist monks are sometimes dispatched to meditate among the corpses in the charnel house. They might find the same insights contemplating the excavated heart. It looked like a small animal, suddenly unearthed, a mole blinking in the bright ruin of a roofless lair. It beat on bravely in the third-degree light, flexing and kicking, undaunted by the flood of unfamiliar air. It seemed almost foolhardy, pressing on in the face of such great peril. It was the size and color of a mango, and the way it looked, streaked and smeared with blood, could have been a mango floating in a compote of mashed strawberries. Hours passed, mesmerized by the body's heart. I had the unsettling sense it was not just the mind's heart that was vaporous, but that the mind itself, mind, self, soul, psyche, all the pronoun agencies and whatchamacallits of self-consciousness that had been nattering for centuries about the phenomenology of forms and essence and reason and free will and choice and anxiety, all of them suddenly seemed as delusional as characters in a movie speculating on the nature of their existence apart from the projector. Where was the Valentine now? What life was there apart from the pump? Meditative hours, passing in the pure concentration of work. The surgeons rerouted Mrs. Donadio's blood, rigging the tubes that would carry it to the bypass machine and back. When a cannula was slipped into the great arch of the aorta, a geyser of blood sprayed up and flecked the goggles of the people leaning in to assist Dr. Oz. Long red strands of Mrs. Donadio's saphenous vein were snipped out of her leg and dropped into a saline solution in a cup. Her circulation was shifted onto the machine, and Oz began the procedures that would cool and slow the heart that had first begun to beat when the cells that formed Mrs. Donadio's body were 25 days old. The heart that had been pushing out 5 quarts of blood a minute, 75 gallons an hour, 70 barrels a day, never stopping year after year after year. And now with a dose of potassium chloride, the same compound used in intravenous executions, Mrs. Donadio's heart came to a stop. It was ready to be repaired. Oz clamped a section of the vein from Mrs. Donadio's leg and began to sew the graft into the slippery vessels. He liked to have his hands in a flow state, and toward that end, he would often start surgeries with Bruce Springsteen playing on the tape deck and close them with Vivaldi. He peered intently through the head loops that magnified 3.5 times the slippery red tissue of Mrs. Donadio's heart. He requested sutures and clamps, and later units of lidocaine, and at one tense point, he brought Mrs. Donadio's heart off the bypass machine and it began to beat chaotically. He snapped at his surgical nurse for failing to test the defibrillator. If it doesn't defibrillate, it's not a defibrillator. All the while, Julie Motz periodically called out soft directions to her assistant, Sally Smith, to move her hands. Julie floated her hands above Mrs. Donadio's temples and squatted down and held the woman's shoulders and touched the crown of her head. Sally held Mrs. Donadio's ankles and then switched from the small toe of Mrs. Donadio's right foot to a point on the sole known as the bubbling spring. The bubbling spring was the terminus of the kidney meridian, and in Julie's experience it usually felt flat and undercharged in heart patients. She looked up at Sally and said quietly, "Did you feel that?" Sally nodded. It felt like the energy picked up. There was a smoothness to it, Julie said. You had to mark their dedication, if nothing else. They both stood there through the long hours of the operation, witnessing something that seemed too intangible to matter in the OR. Anyone untrained in the art of hands-on healing might wonder what they were doing. Even knowing a little bit about what they believed they were doing wouldn't clarify it much, as the metaphors of running energy, holding energy, and checking energy could only breed more metaphors. Maybe the healers were up on the promenade deck of the SS Donadio, arranging recliners, while Oz and company were down at the waterline, trying to repair the rips and keep the good ship afloat. Maybe they would have been just as effective, the healers, had they been priestesses chanting the pain-allaying words of the Heart Sutra, which ends, gone, 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 beyond gone, altogether, beyond, oh what an awakening, all hail. Or the beautiful heart prayer from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. My heart, my mother, twice. My heart, my coming into an existence. Not be their resistance to me in the judgment. Not be their repulse to me by the divine chiefs. Not make thy separation from me in the presence of the keeper of the scales. Thou art the double within my body, forming and making strong my limbs. If the body's heart does in fact have a double life, if there is such a thing as the mind's heart, and can anyone who has ever loved doubt this? There is such a thing. If there is such a thing as the 4th chakra, the high heart, the seat of the soul, perhaps it can be found in the feeling of heartache and the concomitant idea of shared fate, of compassion born out of the understanding that when you stare into the mortality of someone else's heart, the mortality of your own stares back. Thou art the double within my body. A week later, Mrs. Donadio was sitting in her hospital room with her husband Joe, who worked as a parking enforcement officer. She'd climbed a set of stairs and traveled the length of the hospital solarium She'd washed her hair. Her appetite was back. The zipper-like wounds on her chest and left leg were mending nicely. She was eager to sleep in her own bed and sit on a deck and squeeze her dog, Bo. Dr. Oz and Julie Mott's and Sally Smith stopped by to see her. Oz said she'd be going home soon. He was wearing blood-stained clogs and in his white coat with the heart ornament pinned to the lapel. He lingered for a bit, then ducked out to check the other patients. She's euphoric now, he said to me. I want her to get greedy. Her purpose is not just to survive, it's to go out and do great things. Julie Motts and Sally Smith stayed with Mrs. Donadio a while longer. When I moved my hands to your kidney meridian, I felt that something was making you angry, Mott said. And I whispered to you, Joyce, I want you to roar. I want you to push the anger out through your chest. It seemed like there was some old anger. I got an image of a car. Does that make any sense? Mrs. Donadio looked puzzled, but then she said, when I was 6, my parents drove off without me once, left me up at Lake Hopatcong. I was abandoned, out by all the cars. Were you angry? Maybe I was, she said, but it was recent history that seemed to be preoccupying her now. It was like a blessing to have you there, she said to Motts. I was so afraid, and you made me relaxed. I was so at peace because I knew you were there. She was definitely scared, and it relaxed her, her husband said. Thank God they did not wheel me in there by myself, she said. I asked her how it relaxed her. Julie was saying that my veins were going to take over the work of my arteries, and I just started to float. At last, somebody was telling me what wasn't going to hurt, but what was positive. She has such a wonderful touch. I told my girlfriend about it on the phone, and she said, what is she? And I said, I don't know. Julie Motts and Sally Smith smiled. Mrs. Donadio searched their eyes with much gratitude and feeling. Mr. Donadio squeezed her hand. Gone, gone, beyond gone altogether. They were sort of doing inspirational work, Joe Donadio explained. It seemed that what he said was as much for himself and what he didn't understand about the fate of hearts as for anyone else in the room. So that's a abbreviated version of the time when I felt like the heart chakra is just a terrible hoax. And I want to read one paragraph where I felt like where I suddenly understood that it wasn't a hoax. I alluded to this fellow Diane Sarasvati who was deeply upset that you couldn't see the heart chakra when you cut open the body, and about a year later, I went out to a healing school in California, and with an energy and anatomy course, and you learn to put your hands in people's chakras and in the organs of the body, and you can literally feel the difference between the liver. I said in this book that the liver was like listening to a Sony Walkman with really bad batteries. The voice of dread, it runs down, and all the organs had different sensations. And when I read them out of context over the radio, and everybody started laughing. But there's no other way to try to describe the pancreas. To me, pancreas is like a New Orleans wind blowing over really small grapes. I can feel, and you get these feelings in your hand, and you try to find the words for them. And you start building up a vocabulary of energy signatures, I suppose you'd call it. And I build up, I look back at my notes from that week and I find my own hermetic descriptions, and I'm hard-pressed now to know what they mean. The trauma in Cynthia's back felt like when you go from a paved road to gravel. Cancer felt like dancing in a mosh pit. I don't suppose anybody here knows what a mosh pit is. A mosh pit is punk rockers all packed together in front of the stage, being spit on and gouging each other. The voice of the liver was like a cassette playing too slowly in a Walkman with run-down batteries. The pancreas had an agile hyper feeling. Lymph nodes felt like a humid wind blowing over small grapes. I have a whole lexicon of this stuff, and I don't really know what it means, but it's when I came to the heart, I lost the ability to describe anything. There's a woman named Colette lying down on a healing table, and I'm putting my hands, starting here and going slowly down into the energy of this thing. And I'm going to read that, and we can try to see if there's anything to talk about this. When it was our turn to have a go, I teamed up with Colette and Danielle, giddy with the pleasure of trying. It felt like church in a weird way, and yet you want to laugh in church all the time. I mean, I do. I don't know why. Just like when everything's too reverent, I feel like laughing. So I said, giddy with the pleasure of trying not to laugh in church. Colette lay on the table first. Danielle held her feet, and I approached her heart. Oddly, it was easier to sense activity with my hand above her chest than with my hand directly on the skin. Maybe it was some vestigial connotation of sex getting in the way. I had to shift my hand awkwardly between her breasts. Per instructions, I tried to let my energy sink in, seeing if I could distinguish the sternum from the heart muscle beneath it, and as the teacher had, find the ventricle and then the valves. The value of the exercise as an anatomy lesson was suddenly eclipsed when Colette began to weep. The skin around her eyes bunched up and tears flowed. Having my hands on, or evidently in, her heart elicited strong emotions, she said. "Can you feel me in your heart?" "Yes," she said. Still with her eyes closed and evidently awash in sorrow and heartache, she said that she had only once known a total openness of the heart once in her life. More than anything, she wanted to achieve that state again, but she was too frightened to risk it. "I want what's inside my heart to be on the outside," she said. Her face was glistening with tears. I wasn't about to start weeping. I had too many years of hard-boiled voices telling me, "Turn off the waterworks." But I felt a compassion for her in an intimacy that was as intense as sex, a sex without the jungle frenzy, only the exquisite tenderness. As I was to learn when I was on the table, it was more moving for me to be the one making the connection than to be the recipient of it. I was able to raise my hands above Colette's chest and still maintain from both our points of view the intercourse between us. Now my hands were a foot above her body, but I still felt them to be deeply connected to her. To her what? Her heart? Her essence? Her emotional centers? Or maybe it was what everybody in the room, from the teacher and her assistant on down, would say it was, the heart chakra. In different schools and traditions, you found different chakra locations. But what about all the chakra discrepancies and contradictions? What kind of anatomy and physiology class couldn't agree whether the first chakra hung between the legs like a downward-facing funnel or was set perpendicular to the midline of the body? The teacher chalked such discrepancies up to the paradoxes at the heart of healing. But you could be forgiven if you were dyspeptically reminded of the caption E.B. White once wrote under a cartoon of a kid frowning over a plate of vegetables. "I say it's Spanish and I say the hell with it." If thousands of years of clairvoyant sages and saints and all-seeing know-it-alls and super-omniscient prophets can't settle on the whereabouts of the first chakra, why shouldn't the rest of us dismiss the whole business? Why shouldn't the rest of us take after Dayanand Saraswati and reform ourselves? I would have liked Dayanand to have felt what I could feel with my hands now, 2.5 feet over Colette's body, and to have experienced the same weird urge I had to move my fingers as if they were entangled in a cat's cradle of fine thread. For the record, I was still exploring, mapping the territory. I was not functioning in the capacity of a healer. I could feel a funnel-shaped area above her heart where the air had definite density and texture. Could I be more vague? Certainly. It seemed that I was no longer inside the heart that could be hooked up to a bypass machine, but it was an organ nonetheless. Emotional, not physical. It did not pump or beat or bleed. It broke and ached and loved. It was easily denied, but its essence was undeniable. Now my hands, my presence, were touching some part of it, sharing some of Colette's life, and something wanted to be done. My fingers were doing it. I didn't have to do it. My job, if you could call it that, was to keep up a stream of chatter about how embarrassed I felt to be mimicking the goofy-looking, finger-twiddling, abracadabra stuff that it sometimes seemed healers did because they needed to look busy. But does a child who can't talk quarrel with the process of mimicry? Don't we learn language by mimicking incomprehensible sounds? Science is a social consensus, forged of observations and falsifiable hypotheses. Here was a social consensus, forged of empirical observations made by people who were confirming their findings with each other. Their hypotheses could not be falsified, but did that make the whole enterprise any less rational, especially given that it seemed to be a skill or sensitivity that could be learned? I'll venture to say that my hands had fastened onto some micro-technology known only to them, off limits to my rational understanding. Either that, or they'd had a nervous breakdown and were semaphoring pure gibberish. But it felt right to move my fingers in the air above Colette's heart. It felt right. So that's me making my first step forward. So, Joanne told me this was, a journalist looks at healing. I thought, well, that's pretty boring. I mean, who's really interested in journalists looking at healing? So I don't really want to belabor that theme. But if anybody wants to talk about healing or has any ideas or things that I'd love to, have a discussion about.
Sure. Sorry, I have to leave.
Okay, well, I'm glad you could come, Samuel. Thanks. Yeah.
Could you tell about your experience with Barbara Ann Brennan?
I put her in the second chakra, which is the emotional chakras down here, and it's the second healer I ever went to. I went there with a magazine assignment, and I quickly realized the magazine was going to think that it was a New Yorker. I got a New Yorker assignment to write about healing school, and they thought the piece was insane. But I was really, and there's things about Barbara Brennan. She doesn't. It was I had an amazing experience in her school. I think her school is, it's the industrial version of healing, and whether you can industrialize healing, I don't know. I mean, she calls it healing science. It's really more of a guild. It's a science the way building a carpet, the way a cabinetry is a science. I don't think it is a science in the sense that most scientists would say what science is. It's an empirical guild. I had a parapsychological experience there, a paranormal experience, when I saw a light around her body, and I've never seen it again, and I probably shouldn't even talk about it because, maybe it was just something I ate, but it was amazing, and it really led to this. I mean, it led to the whole book, really, which is why I put it down here, because it was sort of the emotional impetus to break through this sort of crust of ideology that you develop if you're a journalist or if you live in a scientific culture or society. I would recommend her 4-day introductory program, and then if anything happens, she has a 4-year school.
What about her 2 books?
I have both of her books. The first book is a textbook. There's a lot of mistakes, not a lot, there's some mistakes in it that are a little bit disturbing when you wish she had been a little more careful about. In fact, I mentioned in my book, she cites the work of Kilner and his Kilner screens as being some sort of evidence that you can see the aura. Maybe they are, but there was as Joanne put in her book also, there was a work by this guy in '61 in England, Ellison, that really made a convincing case that the Kilner screens were an optic phenomena that was easily explained and nothing to do with energy or with paranormal sensitivity or anything like that. But their books are landmark books. They're probably the most widely used healing books that I know about. The last time I heard, there were probably over 700,000 copies of the first one in print, and she's had an enormous influence. She has a very schematic view of the body, of the 7 bodies, and layer by layer, and it would be great if the body was that neatly organized. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't see 7 layers, but everybody sees their own world. So her world has 7 layers, and a lot of people agree with her. Everybody who goes through school learns to see the world the way she does. But if you study with a great violinist, you sort of learn to play like he plays. So it might have to do with being a mentor or influencing a student, shaping a student.
Have you ever actually experienced healing? Have you ever had a condition that was relieved by?
I had a lot of healings, probably over 200, and there have been some of the most profound experiences of my life, and it had the least to do with what's bothering me. It's weird. I mean, my knee still hurts, my back still hurts. I still have this weird uricus gout in my big toes. I mean, I have bad neck. I still have the kink in my heart none of it's been really corrected. I'm just terribly sensitive to it all now. I mean, in a weird way, healing's been terrible for my health. It has made me hyper aware, and this is there's a strain of hypochondria in my family. My father has it. I don't think I have it, but I think I'm not just making this stuff up. I don't think he is either. But the idea of going to, if I had an illness that I knew about, I would go to a healer as well as try to treat it through the conventional ways. I don't know. I'd hate to have to choose between the two of them. I think that would be sort of frightening.
But have you spoken to people who have had experiences in this way actually?
Yeah, people have had vision, degenerative retinal conditions that have been repaired, and they were scheduled for surgery. That a lot of the people I spoke to, oddly enough, had problems with their eyes. And I talked to someone who had a spine thing, but the eyes were, and this is people I was meeting. I mean, there are patients that had throat things and conditions in their lung. My wife, some of them were, there's a gradation of illness, and so if you're really in bad shape, I know a fellow who had AIDS, and he had, I wrote about him in my book. He had Kaposi's sarcomas all over his face, some of which were taken off by radiation. There was one that chemotherapy and radiation could not touch. And Rosalind Briere worked on him for 5 days with a very delicate energy out of her hands. I don't know what it was. I couldn't even begin to describe it. You saw my attempts to describe the liver, so I'd probably end up with some appliance running down with no batteries. But the lesion is gone. To her, it was no big deal, and to him, it was a huge deal. He wrote a paper about it, and it sort of made it. And he said, that was the least of what she did. That was because when you're not familiar with healing, you're very impressed by the stunts and the kind of the wow, I had this incurable disease cured, and it's really, I don't really think it's about curing disease at all. It's really about just it's about putting depth in the flatness of everything. It's about catching up with yourself, and suddenly your whole definition of what you are triples, and then quadruples, and then goes through, and then suddenly your field of what if you start to think of your being as a field, the field gets bigger. There's more of you in it, and that seems to be what it's about. And if you're really sick, you may not care at all about that, but maybe you're thinking about illness. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but there are people that get treated for very concrete physical things, but you quickly come up against the problem that and this is a philosophical problem, that mind-body is a false dichotomy, physical is a false estimation of what we are, that there really is no entity that's separate from one thing or the other, and yet we live as if they are separate, and we feel that things are separate. Something happens to us, not to me. I was impressed by Stephen Brownie's story of the Zen nun who refused to say that she was hungry. She would just say, there is hunger, it is hungry, or there is hunger here, she would say. That seemed fanatical, but being a nun seemed maybe fanatical too. So if you could achieve fanaticism to be a nun, you could achieve that kind of integrity about denying the dualistic aspects of conventional reality. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the work of this Dr. Oz that you're talking about in your book?
Yeah,
and maybe give us an update.
When he first did this, it was a kind of a curious experiment, and he said, I spoke to him recently. He said that he now has a book out called Healing from the Heart or something. So does Julie Ma. 3 people I wrote about wrote books, and then they published them before my book came out. It was unbelievable. Dean Radin is a parapsychologist. Julie Motz, who's the healer in the thing, has a book, and Oz also has a book. And they're all like, they're writing books. They're just, and they do it like in 3 months or something. He said he's gotten to be quite well known for his experiments, and his he had some unsuccessful. He tested 3 healers in a lab. 2 of them had no effects at all. 1 healer was able to slow down, to retard the cell division rate in some cancer cells, and they're going to try to do more work with that guy. It's very hard to set up the protocols to test these people, and he wants to get these things not into journals that doctors don't read, but into things like cardiology and JAMA and things like that. He wants to get the mainstream involved in this. He says the more attention he's gotten, the more hostility he gets now from his departments and the chief of medicine in Columbia. But there is a division now of complementary medicine at Columbia, and it's very successful financially. And it's still the reputation of it is still, it's like I guess medicine is so hierarchical in its reputation. People have various, I guess certain doctors look down on other kinds of doctors, and these people are at the bottom of the status ladder. But they don't care because they're getting the patients, and the patients are really leading this revolution. Yeah.
Found any healers that have negative effects?
Well, there's some, they're editors. Actually, they're all in the magazine world. Well, I'll say yes and no. That'll be paradoxical. I wrote about a healing relationship that went really bad. In fact, it's the 5th chapter. It's the throat chakra, and it went bad because the healer was a very talented healer. She was a young healer. She was a student healer. I was her guinea pig. She wrote. She treated me probably 20 times, and then you wrote up reports for her senior thesis, and then I wrote about undergoing healing. And then she was also she's a novelist, or wants to be, and she gave me her manuscript, and then we had a terrible argument about it. I critiqued it, and she got upset, and I don't know, this was a case of not really so much negativity in the healing, in the crucible, the temenos, the sacred space of the healing transaction, but what's all around it. And healers are, they're just like everybody else. I don't know if you guys feel this way, but you look, people who have any kind of extraordinary skill, you kind of venerate them a little bit. Particularly if they're looking at your body and saying, wow, you've got a leak on out of your kidney meridian, and you've got energy kinking around your heart chakra. That's why that's why your left arm feels weak. I didn't say anything about my left arm. This guy tells me what's going on with my body by looking at me in 10 seconds. And I suppose it's like holding up the big lighter to the Stone Age tribe and saying I can make fire come out of my palm. And it feels like magic if you're not used to their skills or their technology. So I'm a little overawed by them. They're like superhuman in a way, but they're not. They're just full of egotism and blindness and dogma and maybe even lunacy, which is a little frightening when you want to trust what they're doing, and yet you don't know if you're being led off onto lily pads up a bunch of moonbeams, And so I was always looking for a reality principle, whether it was in humor, whether it was a sort of deflation, someone would deflate their claims, or I never saw it in this woman. I saw she was so saturated in ambition that she was blind to her own abilities as a writer, and therefore it spilled over into our healing transaction. And I spent a lot of time writing about it, so I probably wasn't very nice either. There's a wonderful, I'm going to read this quote. It's from Edward Whitmoff, who's a Jungian healer. It's a wonderful book, why can't I remember the name of the book? It's in my notes. Healer and patient are destined actors with archetypally assigned roles in a sacred performance. The healer's personality is overshadowed by the stage mask of the healer god, which includes his potentially dark side, the divine intruder destroyer. The patient's archetypal role is that of the supplicant, but harbors also a healer destroyer in its unconscious depths. So, you think you're going there for this nice loving encounter and realize unconsciously you're both trying to destroy each other. But that can happen. That sort of intimacy, like in a marriage or a relationship. That's the weird thing about this. It's like getting married for an hour in some way, because there's a loss of borders. There's a redefinition of the self. That the self is what a poet David Ignatow once called the wild third thing that happens when two people are together. I always love that, the wild third thing. He turned the wild third thing into a bagel and had it rolling away down the street with two people chasing it. But that was a sort of symbol for the overlap between two people. So, I don't know. Anybody else? Joanne, you want to say something?
How did I do? Sure, when you first came in to the library,
I know we relate to the library.
oh, yes, yeah, got to. You had recently done the article on Dean Radin.
Yeah, he's a parapsychologist who I wrote about it in chapter 6.
How did you get from Dean Radin to healing?
Well,
How did you get to Dean Radin?
I guess, and I don't want to say anything sensitive to parapsychologists, but it sounds like that their future is in healing in some ways. I mean, healing is where parapsychology sort of intersects with ordinary people's lives, maybe dreams and clairvoyance and things like that, but healing is really a practical use of the clairvoyant skills. I mean, those parapsychological skills that parapsychologists study come sort of beautifully and breathtakingly into use in the healing room, and they seem much more relevant to people, and they have a personal interest in them. Therefore, but I think in order to look at clairvoyance or to and its associated things like psychokinesis or telepathy, you have to go back to the academic and scientific basis of it and look at the controversies there. And the controversies there are the same as they are in the healing world. I mean, I'm still smarting over a review I got from a technology writer who said the whole thing's flaky, and like, well, piss up our rope, I just really just didn't, I was just dismissing it. There weren't enough, silicon channels in healing for him or something. But it's hard to deal with this, and I guess everybody's interested in it. It sort of feels like they're doing something that's slightly deviant. Maybe not.
Send them to the research, though. The research is there. It's solid.
It is, but it's not like the research on drug research where there's thousands of studies. There's maybe, how many great studies are there about healing studies?
Books of them. Okay, do you know Dan Benoor's thoughts?
Yeah, I know those, and that's he himself knocks down about 40% of the studies that he cites.
But the ones
finds faults
are really good.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably less than 20 great studies. I mean, I wrote a lot about Bernard Grad, and I've even seen his studies criticized for transient, the effects of the healer are transient. Grad actually he's wounded mice in a sort of benign way, and then had a healer named Oscar Estebany put his hands on them and try to speed them up. And Estebany was able to effectively increase the rate of healing by 2 days over a 2-week period. He would speed up the rate at which the mice got better. And the real strong mainstream critic of that study said, well, it's just that if they wait 2 more days, the mice will be better on their own. But 2 days of hospital bills is $1,000. It used to be $1,000, probably more. So I don't think there. I mean, Joyce, you may have a better sense of this now, but I don't. Most of the doctors I know are not very. Even when they know the studies, they're not. They're impressed by Grad. They're Daniel Wirth, who did the replication of that study, but then he did another one that found the results were not confirming the initial study. And all people in the public, all they hear about is things like the Emily Rosa thing, the 4th grade girl who says healers can't tell which hand you're holding your hand over.
I'll be hearing more, though, because since NIH established that alternative medicine, this made a major difference. We've been trying to get people to study healing with us for years.
Right.
And until that happened, they wouldn't. And then they began to come out of the woodwork because they would have been laughed at.
Yeah.
Laughed at silly if they hadn't had that. And then it continues to be there. Elizabeth Tard has a group, about
I know her. She's doing
University in San Francisco, and they just published a study of distance healing with advanced AIDS patients that's come out in a medical journal.
I mean, I didn't even dare raise distance healing. I thought it's one thing to have hands on, but when the one person's in New York and the other person's in Buffalo or Singapore, trying to explain that or even to make it plausible was so hard. I said, I'll just leave that one for the next generation to account for.
But to live with it as a reality without explaining it is something we have to do.
But we live with everything without having a decent explanation for it. I mean, I don't know how you move your arm right now. I don't know why. I mean, my wife is going to have a baby in for the first time that I know about in June, and I don't know where this thing's coming from. I don't know what causes these proteins to start ramifying and diversifying and differentiating. And, I'm in awe of it. It goes back to the illimitable whirlwind. As Carlyle said, what is this force? This is the fundamental question, and this is the old tension between the mechanists and the vitalists, and the vitalists have been on the run for 150 years. The mechanists have driven them into a corner, and yet they kind of have given them the slip, I think, or they seem to be now. I don't know whether science, if more and more we're just a bunch of self-replicating proteins, and all of our conceits about what we are secondary, or our conceits about what we are primary, and everything else, and everything follows from that. So.
Can you be comfortable simply waiting for the paradigm to shift to mature and come to reality?
I don't think it's going to shift that much. I mean, I don't think it's going to shift the way the sun shifted, the Copernican paradigm shifted. I don't think it's going to. I think it'll just be absorbed. People are, for one, most of Americans already believe in angels and God, and it's only the scientists who are skeptical of these things. I mean, the public doesn't pay any attention to what the scientists believe. It's just the media that tries to hold up some kind of rationalistic example, or semi-rationalistic example. But the real hostility toward this is from the most educated people in the society. You know that better than me. You've experienced it. No?
It's changing.
Well,
it is changing.
It is.
It's changing, yeah.
But you see it as an earth-shattering shift that's going to reorient the way we understand the body and deal with each other?
It's going to change our attitudes very basically. So basically, they would have to reformulate, and it may not be able. We, as a generation, may not be able to live in that linear fully.
Yeah.
It may take another generation to be able to do that. I think it's going to be that giant. Yeah.
Well, I'm heartened by your optimism. I'm heartened by your optimism. Yeah.
I think it still sounds very animistic to me, and if you don't surmount the animistic boundaries, I think you'll get no place.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm saying. I agree. I do think that the vitalism and animism are essentially the same.
This is half of the truth.
Yeah.
And since the evidence is there for that other side, why not use that as a possibility of getting a common denominator? Because you won't get any truth without it.
Yeah. I don't think anyone's going to ever throw away the scientific methods to.
Well, you can have scientific methods without believing in angels.
You can't have them.
Oh, you can certainly have them.
Can you have them? Really?
Well, I've had them for 50 years.
You have? Yes. Are you saying you have scientific methods without believing in angels?
Oh, absolutely. You have to believe in anything. Believe or disbelieve when you don't have facts.
Yeah.
And belief is the uncritical acceptance of something you can't prove.
Mm-hmm.
Now, disbelief is prejudice. So neither one of them is any good. And I think you have to investigate on a purely scientific level, but without the restrictions of animism.
Yeah.
I mean, the late Dr. Bender in Freiburg, who hated me passionately, probably still does where he is, always looked desperately for all kinds of explanations for the phenomena that could clearly only be explained in a spiritual way, because he just could not accept it. It was against his philosophy. And I think that when you drop that kind of philosophy, whoever has it, you get answers. The answer is that the healer is not a healer unto himself. I think the simplest way to describe it is not by you, but through you.
Yeah.
And once you investigate that relationship, you might get some new answers.
Yeah. Well, I think actually I would never say healers do something. I think I would say they may do things, or they seem to do things, or things happen in their presence. So that's my way of avoiding that agency.
That all has happened when you look for it.
Yeah.
It's there. You don't have to believe it, angels. So.
No, I was only raising the angels thing because of saying where the American population is. I mean, they have beliefs that are way out, much wilder than anybody else in the academic world.
The camera does not lie when it's used under test conditions. There are test conditions. But you don't have any belief involved. Belief, I hate belief.
Well, that's an epistemological argument, because I would say and there's a great, the E.M. Cioran, or Cioran, the Romanian philosopher, says that everyone who breathes believes in something. And there's a layer at which you, by your very existence, you have either, maybe it's not belief, maybe it's trust. You trust that your heart will continue to beat. I mean, you're standing on a foundation of conceptions and preconceptions at some point.
If you do not accept the survival of human personality beyond physical death, then of course you restrict yourself. If you accept that as a factual...
Do you accept that then?
Absolutely.
Oh, so that's a belief then, right?
Not a belief.
The survival of human personality beyond death is not a belief.
Not a belief.
What is that? That's a fact?
It's a fact.
I'd like to read about that somewhere in the New York Times. I'd like to see that. I'd like to see the government seal on that.
The hell with the government. The camera does
No,
not.
I would say that if you asked 1 million people, 999,000 would say that would be a belief.
But that's not true anymore.
Well, I think that leads
That's
us to another evening for sure. And I certainly thank
Well, thank you.
Chip for his very illuminating book.
Thank
A
you.
lot of food for thought. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
What's next, Chip?
I mean, to write about? I'm trying to do a book about dreams. I don't really know what I'm going to do about it, but I sort of want to... I don't know why. I sort of just still...
Hi there. My name is Lisette Coley, and I serve as president of Parapsychology Foundation. I want to welcome you to the Foundation's YouTube channel. There's already a wealth of information available posted, and we have plans to continue to post our classic lectures and new materials, so you don't want to miss out. So hit that bell, please subscribe, and you'll be notified. And hope you enjoy.